I probably should say just a couple of words. So my name's Alex Marshall. I'm the European culture reporter for the New York Times, and so I spend most of my day writing about stories at the intersection of arts and politics, because it seems that most artists and designers eventually want to annoy someone in government. So, and sometimes this comes up in surprising ways. I mean, last week there was a very interesting story about the Swiss embassy in the UK trying to recruit a designer or artist to try and look at how art and design can affect mediation. So I spoke to the ambassador, and he really does want to see if art and design can have a role in solving international geopolitical disputes. He last year tried to get an artist into the talks about the Iran de-weaponization issues. So you can have design and art can appear in all sorts of interesting ways, and that's what we're going to hope to explore today. Unfortunately, Justine has to go very, very quickly, so she's going to do a short presentation, and then hopefully we can get you to ask her a couple of quick questions before she heads off, and then we'll get everyone else up on stage. So yeah, please, Justine.
Brilliant, thank you. Can you hear me all right? It's okay, it's working? Yes. Okay, so thank you. Thanks everyone for inviting me here. It's a really important and timely conference. So I've been asked to set the scene for London, to give a bit of an overview of culture and creativity, and also to set it in a global context. So I'm going to try and do it in 5 minutes, so hold on to your hats. The first thing I think it's important to say is that the world is spinning. Politics, the economy, technology, world power structures, they all seem to be in this state of flux right now. A state that is unfathomable and often quite scary, actually. In politics, you can see new alliances forming, old alliances adjusting, economic power bases are shifting. In technology, the fourth industrial revolution is well underway. Our lives seem to be run by algorithms these days. And although the world is smarter and more connected, loneliness is worse than ever. There's mass migration and an increasingly fragile environment. In Britain, we're in the midst still of an existential crisis over Brexit. Unlike when regular people get divorced, I think this divorce we're having with Europe is all-consuming and seemingly endless. I've been trying to make sense of it myself, and in the spirit of rigorous inquiry, I turned to Google. And apparently there are 5 stages of divorce. The first is anger, which is all about blame, rage, and cynically dissecting events. So I think we can relate to a bit of that with Brexit. Stage 2 is bargaining, battling with doubt and guilt. Stage 3 is depression. This is when reality sets in for both sides and we all get very fed up. 4th is acceptance, that's when peace breaks out. And finally, conclusion, and that's getting on with your life. But in Britain, I think we're caught in this kind of midst of this cycle of 1 to 3. So we're in anger, we're bargaining, we're depressed, then we're back to anger, then we're bargaining for a new deal, then we're depressed again. So we're in this kind of draining cycle, I think. And what this tells us, I think, that in Britain, but also around the world, the pace and the scale of change and the challenges that we're facing as global citizens are unprecedented. And, as these tectonic plates shift, I think a question we've all got to ask ourselves is, where does culture and creativity fit into this picture? In London, which I'll talk about now, I think we look at culture and creativity as our DNA here. Creativity as this kind of essential fuel that drives the city. Whenever we ask people consistently why they come to London, always 4 out of 5 say it's culture. And when you think that, last year over 30 million people came to London, 4 out of 5 coming for culture and creativity is a really, really big deal. Creative industries in London, they generate £52 billion a year for our city. 1 in every 6 jobs in London is a creative one. But these impressive economic figures, they don't tell the full story of what culture and creativity bring to London. At this more deeper level, I think it offers us something more profound, sitting in a theatre or going to a festival. It's offers us a kind of human connection in this increasingly digital world. One of my favourite quotes by the artist Grayson Perry. He once said, life without art would be a series of emails. So on the face of it, you know, you look at culture in London and you can think, oh, this is an amazing success story. The creative workforce in London is holding up this incredible kind of economic powerhouse that generates billions for our city. It's boosting tourism, packing out museums, stacking up awards, bringing communities together. And all of that is entirely reliant on creative people, creative individuals in our city, on artists, pattern cutters, graphic designers, photographers, instrument technicians. But what we know is that our creative workforce is under quite extreme pressure in London. We know that many Londoners, especially those from poorer backgrounds, don't access culture and creativity at all. The diversity in London, which is our biggest asset and strength, is not reflected in our cultural institutions, in their programmes, or in audiences. Many artist studios have been closing in London over the years. But we really need the creative community in London, and we need our culture to look like London. Luckily for us, Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, has declared culture a top priority. He's the first mayor to have declared that. So that's given us a kind of platform and also the firepower to push forward with some quite bold experiments. And I just thought I'll take you through a few of them now, because they're all quite new experimental ideas. We've established these new creative enterprise zones, there's 6 of them now across London. And the idea of these is to allow artists and creators to put down roots in areas that they have helped to develop. We've started a new creative land trust, and this is a social investment fund that will help to buy artist studios in the long term. So this is all about long-term thinking, protecting London's creativity in the future. We've written and published the first ever cultural infrastructure plan in the city. And most world cities, you know, they plan for things like how many houses they need, how many hospital beds, how many school places, but they tend never to plan for culture. But, you know, with all the pressures that we face in London, we know we've got to plan for culture too. As I often say, as much as, you know, we need good transport and roads, London also needs its soul, and that's where culture and creativity are really at the heart of who we are as a city. We need museums, art galleries, music venues. We've also got a new London Borough of Culture Award, and that is really about shining a spotlight on local culture out in the local boroughs, neighbourhoods outside of the city centre. And we're building a brand new cultural district over in the Olympic Park as our big legacy cultural project. It's called East Bank. And that's with a new V&A, the first permanent outpost for the Smithsonian, Sadler's Wells, BBC and others. But to return to the global context, as well as my day job, I've got the privilege of chairing the World Cities Culture Forum. And it's a network of 38 global cities. This is us in our last global forum in San Francisco last year. So Tokyo to Paris, Moscow to Shanghai, Buenos Aires to Amsterdam. And collectively, what we see is a trend that culture has moved from this niche idea in cities to a mainstream one. What we see is finally a kind of recognition that culture is this essential ingredient in cities and in society. That if you want to be a successful city in the 21st century, you actually can't do it without culture. We know there's lots of evidence that culture transforms lives and places. It's got the power to turn us into critical and curious thinkers, capable of imagining better futures. And design, of course, is at the heart of all of this. Design can address many of these challenges we face in cities today. It can deliver intelligent solutions across all aspects of city policy with depth and sophistication. You know, I'm sure we'll all agree intelligent design can make our lives better and healthier. Thoughtful design can transform our neighbourhoods, and great design can change our attitudes and aspirations. So I just thought I'd end with this great quote that I'm sure you all know from Robert L. Peters, who said, "Design creates culture, culture shapes values, and values determine the future." So I think my message really is that in this kind of crazy spinning world that we're all trying to find our way through, let's not lose sight of the really positive forces of design, creativity and culture. Thank you.
Justine literally has to go in about 3-4 minutes.
So it's okay, so I can take some questions.
Does anyone have any burning questions? Because I'd prefer to take it from you rather than do what a journalist always does and just talk about what they want. I will do that unless does anyone have anything they'd like to ask her? Well, in that case, one of the things that really interests me is, you know, you're obviously talking very much at a local level and, you know, your experience in cities and how, do you see culture and design as having a role beyond sort of advertising almost at a global level? Or is it is culture the main role for you at, you know, changing local lives and dealing with local problems?
I think the great thing about culture is it's not one thing. You know, it is a really sophisticated thing for a city to embrace. So, you know, it is, in London, we're seeing real change in Waltham Forest, the first borough of culture. 100,000 local people have turned up to that. We've just launched it. It's a brand new idea. And then you can see kind of on a global level, whether you are, you know, Oliver Eliasson with Ice Watch, thinking about the environment, that is a big global message that he's pushing. Through the World Cities Cultural Forum, we've got a leadership exchange, which is all of us sharing the bright ideas that we've got in cities. So then you can see lots of cities, as you say, using culture to promote themselves. It's part of their identities, attracting tourism. But that's, I think, the unique thing about culture. It can operate on all these different levels, macro, global, but also personal. You know.
Do you, to play sort of devil's advocate, I mean, one thing, having lived in London pretty much all my life, I've noticed that, you know, the culture people, it's so important to people in this city that it will survive even if politicians don't get involved in it at all. You know, if you look at the collapse of music venues in London, they are moving further out in the city. I mean, do you think to sound bad, if your job was cut tomorrow, London would die as a cultural city, or do you see your role as utterly vital?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, you know, London is an amazing creative city, right? And that is a really vital force. And you know, it's hard to stop that force because it's full of creative people and brilliant ideas and projects. However, I think we've gone past the time when the market will just kind of organise itself and it will survive. You know, one of the things we've been doing at City Hall is tracking the changes in, for example, music venues and artist studios. So, you know, when I first started this job, I was faced with some statistics which were quite sobering. So London over the last decades lost 50% of music venues at a grassroots level. Same for LGBT clubs. Pubs are closing every week. We were looking at, in the next 2 years, losing 30% of artist studios. So, you know, these are stark statistics. You know, creatives often move into an area, rents are cheap, then they get kind of moved out when, you know, they've played a role in the kind of revitalisation of those areas. And, you know, some people say to me, well, artists will always move around, you know, but genuinely, London is an expensive place. There's a limit to where you can still move to. Everywhere is expensive. And so I really believe that, you know, city governments need to take a proactive approach to policy, and that's what we've been doing in London. So, for example, for the very first time, London's planning system now includes an entire chapter on creativity and culture. That has never happened before. So, you know, if you're a big developer moving into an area with a big scheme, now in the London plan, if by you going into that development, there will be a loss of affordable workspace for creatives, it's on you to re-provide that space, and that's never happened before. If you think about music venues, we've introduced for the first time the agent of change, which is it's a planning regulation, and what people don't realise is that previously, if you moved into a new flat next to a nightclub, you could then complain that you'd moved into a new flat next to a nightclub and get that nightclub shut down, which is like nonsensical. So the agent of change is whoever comes last has to mitigate. So if you are a new block of flats moving in next to a nightclub, you have to have proper soundproofing. Equally, if you're a new venue moving into next to a residential area, you have to have your proper queue management and your soundproofing as well. So it kind of makes a more fairer system, and that's something we've kind of driven in London, and it's now been adopted in national planning policy. But something like that transforms the landscape for venues. So we're doing that kind of mix of these kind of systemic hardwiring things through policy, but also we're doing very kind of quick, rapid response stuff. So we set up a culture at risk office at City Hall. 2 years ago, which is a kind of hotline for people who are in a difficult state. And in the last kind of 18 months, we've had 350 cases that we've solved. So, you know, there's a lot of demand for people needing help. And all the time it's bringing people together, the licensing authorities, the police, the venue, trying to find solutions, trying to negotiate ways through. But for the first time, we've seen that those losses in studios, they've stabilised, and so have music venues. And, you know, there's clear evidence that without that kind of push, that proactive policy push from City Hall, we'd still be in a steep decline.
I've just written down the cultural risk thing because I did not know about it, and it sounds like it could be a story for us. So thank you very much for giving me an idea at least. Does anyone have any final questions? Otherwise, I will say thank you very much for your time, Justine, and get everyone else up. So I hope you're a livelier audience for our remaining 3 speakers. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And if everyone else could come up, please. Thank you. We should get everyone to the stage at once. We've got 3 further speakers for you who are going to talk for 5 minutes, and then we're going to have questions and hopefully an interesting discussion. Again, 2 people working in the political field, but also an actual designer herself, who we are going to start with. Meherunnisa Asad is from Pakistan originally, who is an expert in, has revitalised the art of stone inlay, which is a traditional art form and design form over there. And having looked at her website, I wish I had more money and was paid more, because I could fill my entire house with her products. So if you could now talk for 5 minutes, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Let me tell you a love story. Around 30 years ago, a woman chanced upon a semi-precious stone box while browsing in Peshawar's old city. This led her to a master artisan, an Afghan refugee, who would train her in the 16th century Florentine art called pietra dura, or stone inlay. And our journey began. Lel was born. To the Florentines, this act of meticulously fitting stones into intricate forms was synonymous with painting in stone. Within that century, pietra dura spread to Russia, Iran, and across the South Asian region under the patronage of the Mughals. To this day, the art form is being kept alive by a dwindling number of artisans in Florence and Agra. Lel is dedicated to preserving the art form while pushing it towards its contemporary evolution. Since the Afghan conflict began in the late 1970s, millions of Afghan refugees have crossed the border to seek refuge in the city of Peshawar in neighboring Pakistan, making Pakistan home to one of the world's largest refugee populations. The refugees brought with them a rich culture of music and craft amongst many other traditions. Lel collaborates with these refugee artisans and local craftsmen, both male and female. Our palette includes a wide range of semi-precious stones and marble sourced from the mountains of Pakistan. From further afield, lapis lazuli is sourced from Afghanistan and turquoise from Iran. We see the preservation of this art form not just as a means to providing livelihoods in a conflict region, but also as a healing mechanism, a way to sustain hope and belief in the future. We take immense pride in the fact that our bespoke furniture pieces are coveted by art collectors around the world who appreciate the single quality of a Lel piece. Most of our designs are very descriptive and heavily inspired by nature, a theme that resonates across cultures and civilizations. Here are some other examples. And with that, I end my presentation. I feel so honored to be here today and share Lel's story with you all. Thank you.
Can I just ask very quickly, in the, this is you'll have products, you're working with refugees, you're working across a very dangerous conflict border. Do you think the role of your company is to, does it have any effect on the local lives and that political conflict in Afghanistan, or is it more about showing to the world, that there is more to this region than the conflict?
I think the latter. For me, it really is about changing perceptions, putting out a softer image of the Pashtuns, the northwestern border of Pakistan, and the Afghans. I am incidentally a Pashtun myself, so I grew up in Peshawar. So there's that very strong affiliation. Yeah.
Do you think you can be successful in changing that image through what you do, or do you really need almost to start selling, getting your designs and your furniture into almost the White House, perhaps, to convince them, to show them a different side to this country?
I think already we've been very successful beyond our wildest, expectations, because I guess the story just resonates across countries and cultures. War and as a result of war, displacement, migration is a theme that resonates with most people. So, and I guess the work, the workmanship, we've had some immense feedback for the quality of the workmanship, because that's something we did not want to compromise on.
Do you think do you think there's ever any risk, like obviously at the moment in the UK, for instance, and in America especially, you're having a lot of people trying to become very nationalistic and very, especially sort of white men saying that their stories are being forgotten. Do you think could there be a risk that people would go, oh, not another refugee story? Or do you think the stories are so powerful that your model of almost taking those local cultures, those almost at-risk cultures, could be replicated all around the world wherever there is a conflict?
Yeah, I mean, there is that risk, but I mean, I feel like we're doing it for the right reasons. We are very passionate about preserving this art form, which originated in Florence. So it's an Italian technique being preserved by Afghans and Pashtuns in Pakistan and Afghanistan, So I think, that's a powerful story. And we just want to put out the best work that we possibly can. And, that's how we look at it. Yeah.
It certainly changes my perception of a place I thought I knew through reading The Economist too much. From a completely different take, we're now going to go to Eliza Easton, who is the head of the policy unit at. You're up to two things, aren't you?
Yeah. Both are very difficult to explain.
NESTA is the easier one. I hope you all know NESTA. NESTA is one of the most exciting parts of British government policy in a way, and one of the best. Would you call yourself a think tank, NESTA?
It's sort of a think and do tank.
Who concentrate on issues such as AI about 3 years before anyone else starts thinking of them. They're about looking at the future issues that may arise in all spheres, but you focus on culture policy there. If you also look up Eliza's biography on the website, you find out she's a big fan of writing P.J. Wodehouse fan fiction, and let's go with fan fiction, and into attending drag shows. So it's a completely different unit. That's why people shouldn't put information about themselves on the internet. But we are now going to. I think it's much better to know more about people. So please, can you talk about what NESTA does and what you do with the Creative Policy Unit as well?
So I'm actually going to talk very little about what I do. I suppose you've heard a little bit about NESTA. I also head up policy as part of that role for something called the PEC, the Creative Industries Policy and Evidence Centre. It was set up by the UK government as part of their industrial strategy investment in the creative industries, but it's actually independent, and I'll mention some of the research I've done there later. I just wanted to talk about something interesting that happened in 2018, which some may know about here, which is the UK topped the Portland Soft Power Index. And lots of people who work in policy, like me, were, to be frank, completely astonished. We felt that Brexit had obviously made a bit of a laughing stock of our country, whether that was the fact it had happened at all or the way it had been handled. And we felt like soft power, a measurement of a country's ability to attract and persuade rather than coerce, must be in tatters. How on earth had we managed to top this index? But it got me to thinking, and I think we've just had a perfect example of this. International politics isn't actually the thing that defines how most of us think about any given country. And when I think about France, I don't think about the Gilets jaunes. I think about French food, first of all, to be honest. I then think about the Louvre, where I've been, I think about Chartres Cathedral. I think about the fashion. I think about the image of the Eiffel Tower. And obviously, it's really difficult to measure the value of those sorts of things. But governments do understand that that power is real. By seeing and relating to a country's unique cultural assets, as we spoke about, we believe that we're more likely to collaborate and, in very real terms, less likely to fight. And that's why the UK government has recently launched a new soft power strategy, which looks to harness the power of people like P.G. Wodehouse or Harry Potter, James Bond, Vivienne Westwood, Johnny Ive, and their belief is that creativity can influence global policy for good. But of course, creativity can also be a more revolutionary force, and global governments, including our own, come up against artists, musicians, designers, who point out their flaws normally much more effectively than their political oppositions. But governments would be, to put it simply, idiotic to suppress or try to control the creativity within their countries. It's actually essential for countries to build creativity into their future plans. We know, for example, that the future of work, and you have to forgive me, I work with a team of data scientists, so this is the kind of thing that I put on screen. We know the future of creative work is one of creative and social endeavour. It's not of sitting in front of a screen and mindlessly putting in numbers. The robots will be doing those jobs. And here's a piece of big data research I did with my colleague Jill, which looked at which kind of term we looked at 28 million job adverts, highlights whether a job is most likely to grow in the future or shrink in the future in the UK and US. And we found that just asking for creativity is the single greatest predictor of a job's likelihood to grow in the future. And creativity, as we've already heard, is also fundamentally important to all economies. It's growing in the UK at twice the speed of the rest of the economy. We're talking about not just design, but film, fashion, architecture, creative tech. But that's even faster in other parts of the world. And I believe the political power of creativity has never been greater or more needed. I think it helps us relate to each other, to see people as just that, people, in all of their diversity. But these are quite general terms that I'm speaking, and I thought I'd give some specifics as to what I thought that both politicians could do, so that they're not controlling this creativity but supporting this, but also what designers might be able to do. First of all, as I said, I don't think politicians should try to control the creatives in their country. And even when they try to harness it for their political ambitions, it doesn't always work out. It often makes them look quite silly. But there are things that they can really practically do, I think, in all nations, to actually support creatives in their endeavour to improve the world. And the first is thinking about immigration. Almost every country has an immigration system which doesn't think about self-employed people. The UK certainly has one based on big companies employing people. As many people know here, that's just not reasonable for the design industry anywhere. And we've been lucky in the UK to have freedom of movement, which has allowed this really radical exchange of ideas through different countries. And I worry about what that will look like when that goes, if we don't have something that allows those kinds of people to come, work, collaborate in the UK without actually having to be part of a business. The second, school education. I'm worried about what's happening at schools, thinking about not just art, but design technology, which is, in terms of the UK, used to be how a lot of designers got their training, and the numbers able to do that, because it's expensive, have just fallen off a cliff. The third is our innovation system. There's a global definition of research and development, and it only thinks about how you develop widgets. It's got no interest in innovative ideas or content, and surely the way the world's going, we need to be incentivising those sorts of things. But then I also wanted to talk briefly about what designers can do, and I've been really inspired by the conversation already here today, especially around environmentalism. And I think my idea for creatives is to rail both with and against the machine. So it's important to have designers working in businesses, promoting radical ideas, which actually get those large corporates to think again about how they can change things for the better. But we also do want designers, creatives to speak up, to make stands against the kind of political and social norms. So that's my kind of plea to you, but happy to have any questions afterwards.
I think that deserves a clap, to be honest.
I'll take it off my boring data science.
No, that was brilliant. And very, very inspiring. I mean, that was both very inspiring and also incredibly depressing about where things are going to go. Given we're having we're going to get a new Prime Minister soon, and we're down to 2. If you were going to be having like 5 after one of them is chosen, you were having 5 minutes, what would you say is, when you're saying politicians should facilitate, not shape, almost culture, what one thing or 2 things would you say they should do first for culture?
I've got a big laundry list, but I would say that point about immigration to me is key, because it is nonsensical that globally we think people should only be able to move around if they are employed by a large company. Even if it's about economic value, we're going to have to develop a system. We're like creatives are canaries in the coal mine when it comes to this stuff, because people are going to be self-employed across the economy. And I've been speaking to designers and creatives who are so worried about what happens to them after Brexit, whether they're going to be able to continue to collaborate with people in the UK. And so to me, that's such an urgent thing that I know is going to be complicated for the Home Office to work out. So they need to start working out right now.
Do you think there's a risk that, someone, if, someone incredibly famous said, I want to move to the UK, and Rihanna now lives in London, for instance, if she said, I want to move to the UK will go, great, here's your visa. Whereas someone like any of your artists said, I want to move to the UK, I've had 30 years of design training, I can do something which no one in this country can. Because they're unknown, how do you overcome that problem?
So at the moment, the only two ways you can do it are either if you've won an award, like a BAFTA, or if you have about £450,000, which means you're considered an entrepreneur. Right. So, but if you're employed by a large company, you need to be earning about £30,000. They're looking at even reducing that. It just makes absolutely no sense, even within this economic-driven system, to be considering it in those terms. So, I think there are ways that you could develop a system. Going back to what I would say to a government is also to make them think really, really hard about what the fundamental rights of people are from kind of birth through to death in terms of this stuff, because I don't think this is just important in terms of industry. I spend a lot of my time thinking about industrial strategy. Most of my work is thinking about businesses and economic growth and social improvement. But I also do worry thinking about the schools piece, about what it means if you say that only some people should have access to these subjects because they might not be able to get a job, or the job might not earn them that much money. Because actually the benefit that, I don't think I'd be able to talk up here if I hadn't done drama at school. I think about that all the time. And I don't use the drama bit, well maybe I do, but but I think all of this stuff also helps us to develop as human beings, and that's fundamentally important too. So maybe those two things, kind of an urgent economic imperative, sort out the immigration system, and also think fundamentally about what it means to foster human beings and give them access to arts, both at school but also in the wider world.
So I think the message is please lobby if you've got the chance. That's brilliant. Our final speaker is Sarah Mann, who is the director of the architecture, design and fashion team for the British Council, which is a completely different perspective, but also someone who is in a way in the middle of culture and a major government, and who has seen culture's influence all around the world. And so I'm hoping you're going to give us another but equally spiky talk. Thank you very much.
Mine's not actually particularly spiky, but no, it's really inspiring. Thank you. Thanks for having me here to speak to you today. Just as a quick reminder for those of you that might not have encountered the British Council, it's the UK's international organisation for cultural relations and educational opportunities. So we work to create friendly knowledge and understanding between the people of the UK and other countries. We do this by making a positive contribution to the UK and the countries we work with, changing lives by engendering trust, building connections and creating opportunities. And currently we work with about 110 countries. We have offices and colleagues working on the ground in 110 countries all over the world. So I head up the design, architecture and fashion team at the British Council. And we've been thinking a lot recently about why we work in the field of design. What does design mean in the field of cultural relations? And design, we think, allows us to explore our identity, form our futures, exchange ideas, and share challenges. In the 21st century, design defines us. It's our interface with the world. So our design programme seeks to address today's global challenges, exploring the social and cultural value of a wide range of design disciplines. We believe in the need to bring design to a wider audience, challenging perceptions about each other and responding to the complexity of the social, political and environmental context we work in. So I was asked to respond to the question of how cultural exchange allows a platform for cultures to resonate and opens a channel for international exchange. So I wanted to share two very quick examples of things I've worked on recently. The first one being the International Fashion Showcase. There they all are. So the International Fashion Showcase was established in 2012 as a platform for emerging fashion designers to exhibit their work during London Fashion Week, bringing together the diverse voices working in fashion to London from all around the globe. International Fashion Showcase invites us to explore different cultures and consider current world issues through fashion. Working in partnership, the British Council with the British Fashion Council, London College of Fashion and Somerset House, supported by international cultural organisations and embassies, selected 16 emerging international designers from 16 different countries. And here you can see on the left, there's David from Brazil, all the way through Ronnie from Lebanon, Tebe Magugu from South Africa, and we've got Curtis from Canada. We had 4 continents represented in IFS this year. And that sense of camaraderie and international exchange and a sort of shared challenge was really vital to the success of this programme. So these designers went through a creative residency in an 8-month business development programme with LCF and Somerset House and the British Fashion Council. And it culminated with a free exhibition during London Fashion Week in February this year, showcasing their work through a series of spatial installations which explored the urgent issues and new ideas shaping fashion. And this raft of young designers were all from very different backgrounds and contexts, but they were all tackling really big issues in their work, while also juggling hyper-local contexts alongside communities, makers and artisans. The title of the exhibition was Brave New Worlds, and explored how today's young designers are facing unprecedented challenges. In a world where issues around sustainability, responsibility and identity are paramount, the idea of fashion itself is being questioned. How should designers be contributing to the global shift in our values? Taking sustainability as the beating heart of their practice, the featured designers looked to more personal, resonant issues of the countries and communities they hail from, to suggest different ways of making and consuming fashion. Yet their worlds also engage with imagined science futures to embrace the tension between technology and craft, exploring exciting new ways of creating positive change. Another common thread throughout is this move away from the emphasis on the sole creator, or the star designer. They embrace a more collaborative approach to designing, drawing from the community groups and cooperatives to share a platform for creativity. One of the most powerful legacies of the projects has been the friendships and networks and new projects that have grown between this group of designers, all of whom share the vision that fashion plays a vital role in our common future. They demonstrate the power of diversity and agency and how sharing practice and ideas can be a force for change. And this is the brilliant Duran Lantink, who's a Dutch designer working with luxury good dead stock in front of his installation at Somerset House, which is a wrecked luxury goods store. But perhaps one of the best examples of where culture, politics and diplomacy meet is the Venice Biennale. The idea of national representation dates from the Biennale's first year of 1895. As the Biennale grew, so did the Giardini, where the nations constructed national pavilions, whose architecture often reflected how a nation chose to represent itself. The British Council has invited artists and architects to represent the UK in this pavilion since 1938. This is actually Barbara Hepworth's exhibition from 1950. You can see her sculptures just in the foreground. There have been increasing questions over the validity of national representation in the face of globalisation, but the response of artists and architects who've exhibited in this rather polite neoclassical tea house demonstrates the power that comes from the tension between the building, the context, and their own work. This annual exchange of ideas continues to grow, and increasing numbers of national representation supported by governments all over the world now seem to signal forward-thinking and open societies who entrust artists, architects and curators to form new global perspectives through their work each year. And just as an example, since 1950, we've been quite busy. In 2018, we commissioned Cruises Engine Architects and artist Marcus Taylor to build Island, this metaphorical structure which wraps the pavilion in scaffolding, supporting a newly formed piazza on the top of the building. It was a very interesting comment on Brexit and touched on things like isolation, a kind of drowning raft in the Sea of Venice. The galleries below were left empty and turned over to dialogue and performances, some of them in collaboration with other countries, pavilions and guests from the UK, turning the building to a site of exchange. At the very heart of everything we do is the power of connecting people through creativity. In an increasingly polarised world, dialogue and creative exchange builds empathy, and it's empathy which is at the heart of cultural relations, a way of building lasting relationships regardless of politics through people-to-people exchange. As the world faces greater challenges, design presents an opportunity to resonate with each other, to collaborate together, redesigning systems, services and products which reflect the diverse societies we live in.
Thank you. One thing that comes out immediately to me about from your presentation and building on everyone else is, do you think almost policymakers need to give design more attention? Because in terms of dealing with real world issues and actually affecting change, you've seen in On the Border, that's the one, politicians spend so much time focusing on music or books, and yet what actually has a real world impact seems to be design, if you like sustainable fashion, or how can you change that focus at all? Do you think it's possible?
It's a really interesting question, and I think it's a really big challenge for all of us who work in design. I think we've yet to make a case to government that's compelling enough for them to put significant funding behind design. I think I was really interested in Eliza's work because I think it's about evidence. I think it's if we have a body of evidence that's compelling enough, it isn't just about the bottom line. It's not about economics. It's about the social value of design. And I think that's the thing we've all got to work on together next, is really proving that value. I think secondly, it's a vast industry. Design is ever expanding. We often talk about the expanding field. Where's the parameter? And how do we understand and communicate design's value to the public and also to government? I think it is about having that support from the grassroots, from the industry, but also then building that body of evidence from the work we do to then demonstrate to government its value.
I know we've got to go to lunch, but we also, those are three really fascinating talks, and I'm hoping you should have questions. If you're going to have questions at any time today, it should be now. So does anybody have one or two to finish? Just over there, the lady in the middle.
Thank you very much for a very interesting and challenging talk. But I would like to ask you, how do you see the role, and you have invariably touched on refugees, and how do you see the role of design in helping bring to a greater part of society, the mainstream society, the conversation about refugees, those who do not look like us, who do not talk like us, but they're, and I like Ms. Asad's work because she's bringing, preserving something that's, and working with the people of Peshawar, that it's something that we know about, we hear about the conflict in those sometimes far away places, but there's much to be said about the role of design in supporting not just the conversation about refugees, but refugees themselves. Could you help, please? Thank you.
Yeah, please go.
I mean, I'd just like to clarify that we didn't choose to just work with refugees in Peshawar. The refugees actually brought this technique to Peshawar, and the woman that comes up in my presentation is actually my mother, who happened to chance upon a small mosaic box in Peshawar's old city, which led her to a master artisan. I feel, sorry, I mean, can you just, did I answer your question, or can you clarify, elaborate slightly what your question is?
Yes, I understand that. But
how are we using design?
Perhaps, Ms. Easton, you're the one who talked about providing policy, influencing policy and evidence, and I wonder, and bringing the creative and the design alongside policy decisions. And so, how do we marry that with, or how do we help the refugee people?
How do you change perceptions of refugees, basically, with through policy and designs working together, I suppose?
Thank you.
I think probably, I mean, there was a little bit of it in all of our presentations, but I think for me, the idea that you see something exclusively through political turmoil can be a very sort of a really reducing way of seeing any part of the world. And I was really interested in terms of your presentation, actually you know, as you said, it's something you read about in the kind of FT newspaper pages, a country, and that's the only way you ever see them, when there's this huge, you know, culture behind it. And actually giving people an opportunity to see things a different way can change how you see a country. And that's, I suppose, where this idea of soft power or cultural relations comes from. In terms of specifically, I mean, I'd say you're much better placed. I think I've seen the power of designers to bring, and actually creatives in general, to bring attention to almost any issue. And I have to say, for example, thinking about the current interest in oceans, we already spoke to a bit about it. The idea that it was a television show that kind of kicked that off in terms of, you know, the launch of Blue Planet really had people talking about the issue that had been around for ages, but it's this combination of kind of activism and creatives thinking about how you tell a story coming together can also get people behind an issue. So you need both. You need to both bring attention, in my mind, to the issue itself, but also not reduce any given place simply to that issue, to allow it to be a kind of full place on its own, not summed up by one political issue.
And the way you would be using design is that we are evolving basically the art form, right? We are reinventing it. And that is something that we really try to explain to the artisans, because they brought with them this technique and a very kind of typical way of working, and you know, designs that they've been reproducing for centuries. So it was difficult for us initially to explain to them that that's not what we wanted, that we wanted to change the designs or reinvent the art form. So I think perhaps that answers your question better.
I think just as a random comment as a journalist, I find it really hard at the moment, thinking a lot about, I get contacted by people working with refugees a lot. And so often it focuses on the refugees as sort of helpless individuals who are still going through, you know, they're at the moment of struggle. And, you know, I find it hard, is that what the public wants to read? Is that the only context in which I can tell a refugee story? And I wish it wasn't. I mean, you know, that's why I love your work so much, because it's completely different to that.
But I'd like to add that recently our artisans were invited to Sharjah on a project that we collaborated with the Sheikha of Sharjah, and they were flown in from Peshawar and Afghanistan against all odds. It was a nightmare because most of them don't even have ID cards, let alone passports, and like then getting visas. And so it was a logistical nightmare. But I mean, I think they now take immense pride. We are a small collective, but the small number of artisans that we work with, I think they understand now after many years, you know, and they take immense pride in the work that they do. And these are highly skilled artisans who are also highly paid. So, you know, that's something I'd like to point out.
Is there one final question? Yes.
Sorry, I just wanted to, do I need the microphone? I just talk really loudly. Thanks.
Just to, Sarah, you mentioned Duran, that extraordinary Dutch designer who, as I understand it, he was featured on the radio the other day in a conversation that Nick Knight was having, I think, that he takes half a Dries Van Noten skirt, half a Prada skirt, puts them together and recycles so much of the fashion that's otherwise going to get shredded. And just coming back to this point I raised earlier about, you know, this huge piece of audit committee that was presented on fast fashion, which presented what seemed to be 10 brilliant, you know, proposals, rather sort of conservative proposals for how we might combat what seems to be contributing 3 times as much pollution as the aviation and the shipping industry put together, fast fashion. And you said, you know, from your point of view, I'm sure you are battering away at the doors, but help us understand why those policies haven't been accepted or adopted. Help us understand from the British government's point of view as you've been trying to make them listen to you.
It's a great question. I think it was a shock for everybody, actually. I think there are some sort of driving factors which are economic. But again, I think it comes back down to, can we demonstrate that through data, through evidence, that there is an alternative pathway? I think that's what's so inspiring about this cohort of designers and someone like Joanne, is that actually instead of waiting for a government to make a policy change, these young designers are setting out remaking their own systems, their own worlds, that work for themselves and that are a more equitable way of making and building a community of makers. I think it's difficult because I think we can wait for politics, we can wait for policy, but in the end, I think as designers, we have a responsibility to kind of get on with things and to make our own universes as fair and as sustainable as possible. I think we all need to be a bit more vocal about what we want. I think we need to work a bit more in coalition. I think particularly I work across architecture, design and fashion. I often think it's a great shame that there isn't more of a bridge between those disciplines because we've got a lot to share. And the sort of data and evidence we could gather across those disciplines and make a case for a more sustainable way of practicing and trading in the built environment or in fashion would be a lot more compelling if it were more diverse.
Yes, very quickly. Oh, you're telling me to round up. I was going to, I thought it was a question, but just one very quick thing. Don't look up people's biographies 3 weeks before you do share a summit and then go back to it. It's not fan fiction. It's the PJ Wodehouse fan magazine called Worcester Sauce, which sounds like an amazing read, and based on Liza's amazing talk, I severely suggest you go and buy it if you can buy it.
No,
sorry.
You can't buy it.
Then don't buy it. Just imagine what it's like, but please use lunch. Those are 3 fascinating, incredibly thought-provoking talks, and this is all about today getting people together. And so I hope you can all meet up and develop new collaborations together after this over lunchtime. So thank them all again, and please come back afterwards.